poor girl hides in a duke's carriage to escape her wicked stepmother. You won't believe what happens next. The rain had not ceased for 3 days. It fell upon London in grey, relentless curtains, turning the gutters of Cheapside into rivers of filth and transforming the elegant cobblestones of Mayfair into treacherous mirrors that caught the gaslight and threw it back in broken fragments. It was the kind of rain that seemed less like weather and more like judgment, the kind that soaked through wool and worsted, that seeped beneath doors and into bones, that made even the wealthiest citizens of the empire draw their curtains and thank God for coal fires and dry parlours. Eleanor Whitcomb had no coal fire, she had no parlour. What she had on this particular evening in October of 1873 was a bruise the colour of a plum spreading beneath the sleeve of her dress where her stepmother's fingers had seized her arm that morning, a torn hem she had not been permitted time to mend, and a terror so complete it had moved beyond panic into a kind of terrible clarity. She stood in the narrow servants' passage behind the townhouse on Curzon Street, pressing her back against the damp brick, her breath coming in shallow clouds that the rain dissolved the instant they left her lips. The passage smelled of horse dung and rotting cabbage leaves. Through the wall, muffled by stone and plaster, she could hear the distant murmur of voices. The dinner party her stepmother was attending inside, hosted by Lady Pemberton, whose fondness for gossip was exceeded only by her fondness for cheap champagne. Eleanor was not invited to the dinner. She had not been invited anywhere in the 14 months since her father's death. What she had been told, in the clipped and venomous tones that Mrs. Agatha Whitcomb reserved for moments of particular cruelty, was that arrangements had been finalised. Mr. Horace Blackwood, owner of 3 textile mills in Manchester, widower, 56 years of age, and possessed of a reputation that made even hardened men of business lower their voices, had agreed to the match. The wedding would take place before Christmas. The settlement would clear Agatha's gambling debts and secure the remaining lease on the house in Holborn. Eleanor had not wept when she was told. She had learned in those 14 months that weeping accomplished nothing in the presence of Agatha Whitcomb except to provide satisfaction. Instead, she had stood very still in the cold morning light of the kitchen, for she was no longer permitted to occupy the upstairs rooms, and felt something inside her shift, like a door that had been locked for a very long time, finally giving way. She would not marry Horace Blackwood. She would not remain in this house another night. Beyond those 2 certainties she had nothing, no plan, no destination, no money beyond the 3 shillings and 4pence she had found in the lining of her mother's old travelling case, hidden in the attic where Agatha had not thought to look. She had her mother's garnet brooch pinned inside her chemise, pressing against her skin like a small, warm secret. She had the clothes on her back, which were not warm enough for October, and a pair of boots that had been resoled twice and were resoled poorly. She had no letter of reference, no relative who would receive her, no friend who had not been driven away by Agatha's systematic destruction of every connection Eleanor's father had once maintained. What she had was the passage behind the townhouse, and beyond the passage, visible through the iron gate that opened onto the mews, a line of carriages waiting in the rain for their owners to finish their port and gossip and retire for the evening. The largest of these carriages bore a crest on its door, a raven in flight above a coronet painted in black and gold. It was the kind of carriage that announced its owner's rank before a word was spoken. The horses were matched bays, tall and still despite the rain, and the coachman sat hunched on the box with his collar turned up, his face hidden beneath the brim of a hat that was rapidly losing its shape. Eleanor did not know whose carriage it was. She did not care. What she knew was that in approximately 10 minutes, when the coachman went round to the kitchen entrance to collect the flask of hot brandy that the servants traditionally offered drivers on nights such as this, the carriage door would be unwatched. She knew this because she had been watching the mews for 3 evenings, learning the patterns of departure and arrival. She knew that the large carriages, the ones belonging to peers, the ones that travelled long distances into the countryside, carried luggage compartments at the rear, some of them large enough for a trunk, or for a young woman, if she made herself very small. She had not planned to choose this particular carriage. She had meant to wait for one heading south, perhaps towards Southampton, where she might find work at an inn or a laundry, any work that would keep her fed while she determined what remained of her life. But the carriage with the raven crest had been standing in the mews for over an hour, and the coachman was visibly cold, and the kitchen door had just opened to release a shaft of warm light, and the sound of a cook's voice calling out to the drivers. It was now, or it was never. Eleanor moved. She moved as her mother had once taught her to move through the garden at night, when they played their secret game of finding foxes in the hedgerow, silently, deliberately, with each foot placed as though the ground beneath it were made of glass. The rain helped. It muffled her footsteps and blurred her outline, and gave her the gift of invisibility that only truly dreadful weather can provide. She passed the first two carriages without incident, pressed close to the wall, and reached the great black carriage with the raven crest, just as the coachman climbed down from the box, with a groan she could hear even through the downpour. The luggage compartment was at the rear, as she had hoped. It was not locked, merely latched with a brass fitting that her cold fingers struggled with for 3 agonizing seconds before it gave way. Inside, the compartment was dark and smelled of leather and cedar and something faintly metallic like gun oil. There was a traveling case already secured within, and a heavy wool blanket folded beside it, and just enough space remaining for Eleanor to fold herself into the gap between them, drawing her knees to her chest and pulling the blanket over her body until she was nothing but another shadow among shadows.
Yes, Catherine, of course,
She pulled
my
the
dear.
compartment door shut behind her.
Sister, you must surely
The
be as
latch
excited
clicked
as
into
I.
place.
Think of all the
The rain
opportunities
drummed
waiting us
against the
there.
roof
I
of
do,
the
my
carriage
dear.
above
I am
her
very
head,
happy for you.
and the world reduced itself to darkness and the sound of her own breathing and the wild, frantic percussion of her heart. She pressed her hand against her mother's brooch through the fabric of her chemise and closed her eyes. "Forgive me, Papa. I cannot stay." She did not know how long she waited. Time behaved strangely in the dark, stretching and compressing in ways that defied the reliable tick of any clock. She heard voices at one point, muffled and indistinct, and then the carriage shifted as someone climbed aboard. The springs creaked. A door closed, not the luggage compartment, but the main cabin. And then, after another interval that might have been 2 minutes or 20, the coachman's voice called out to the horses, and the carriage lurched forward. The movement was violent enough to knock Eleanor's head against the traveling case. She bit down on her lip to keep from crying out, tasted blood, and braced herself as the carriage wheels found the cobblestones and settled into the rhythmic clatter of departure. She felt every bump, every turn, every pothole in the London streets as the carriage made its way through the city. She could not see, but she could map the journey by its sounds. The shouts of crossing sweepers, the clatter of omnibuses, the gradual thinning of noise as they moved beyond the central streets into quieter districts. When the cobblestones gave way to the softer surface of a country road, Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time in 14 months, to weep. She wept silently, as she had learned to do. She wept for her father, who had died believing his second wife would care for his daughter. She wept for the house in Holborn, which had once been filled with books and laughter and the smell of her father's pipe tobacco, and which had become, under Agatha's reign, a place of locked doors and empty cupboards and debts that arrived in every post. She wept for herself, for the girl she had been before all of this, the girl who had read novels by the fire and dreamed of a future that looked nothing like a factory owner's bed. And then she stopped weeping, because weeping was a luxury she could not afford, and because the carriage was slowing. It should not have been slowing. They had been traveling for, she could not judge precisely, but it felt like less than an hour. Hardly enough time to have reached any significant distance from London, perhaps a toll gate, perhaps a change of horses. Eleanor pressed her ear against the wall of the compartment and listened. The carriage stopped. Voices again, the coachman's, gruff, deferential. And another voice, from inside the cabin. A man's voice, low and measured, with the kind of precise diction that came not from effort, but from generations of breeding. She could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the voice of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed. Then footsteps, coming toward the rear of the carriage. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. The latch on the compartment clicked. The door swung open, and the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and wood smoke.
Oh, Charlotte,
A lantern appeared, held high, its light harsh and sudden after the long darkness, and behind it, a face. He was younger than she had expected. A duke, for he must be a duke, given the crest and the carriage and the manner in which the coachman had spoken to him. Ought to be old, grey-haired, ponderous. This man was perhaps 30, with dark hair that the rain had plastered to his forehead, a jawline that might have been drawn with a ruler, and eyes of a color she could not determine in the lantern light, but which regarded her with an expression that contained, in equal measure, astonishment and a very controlled sort of anger. "Well," he said. His voice was even quieter than it had sounded through the wall, and far more dangerous for it. "I was told there was a sound from the luggage compartment. I rather hoped it would be a cat." Eleanor could not speak. Her body had locked itself into position, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, every muscle rigid with the paralysis of discovery. She stared at him, and he stared at her, and the rain fell between them in silver threads. "You are not a cat," he observed. "No, Your Grace," she managed. Her voice was barely a whisper. "No." He lowered the lantern slightly and the light shifted, and she saw that his expression had changed. The anger was still there, but something else had joined it. Something she might have called curiosity, if curiosity could be threaded through with wariness. He studied her face the way one might study a document suspected of forgery. Carefully, withholding judgment, searching for the detail that would confirm or deny. "You are going to climb out of my luggage compartment," he said, "and you are going to explain yourself. If your explanation is satisfactory, I shall decide what is to be done. If it is not, I shall have my coachman return you to whatever gutter you emerged from and consider the matter closed." He stepped back to give her room. Eleanor uncurled herself with difficulty. Her legs had gone numb, and her back ached from the cramped position, and half climbed, half fell out of the compartment onto the muddy ground. She stood before him in the rain, shivering, her dress soaked through, her hair escaping from its pins in dark, wet tendrils, and she knew exactly how she must appear to him. A vagrant, a thief, a creature so far beneath his notice that the mere fact of her presence in his carriage was an affront to the natural order of things. "I am not a thief," she said. It seemed important to establish this first. The contents of my traveling case will confirm or deny that assertion. His gaze moved over her, not with the appraising quality she had learned to associate with men who looked at women, but with the clinical attention of someone cataloguing evidence. Her dress, though soaked and worn, was of decent fabric. Her speech, though strained with fear, carried no trace of the streets. Her boots were poor, but her posture was not. "Who are you?" he asked. The question was simple. The answer was not. She could not give him her real name. If Agatha discovered where she had gone, if word reached Horace Blackwood that his intended bride had fled, the consequences were unthinkable. And yet a lie, told to a duke, discovered later, would be worse. "I am no one of consequence," she said. "I needed to leave London.
Charlotte,
I had no
imagine the
means to do
opportunities.
so.
We must attend
Your
the
carriage
assembly this
was
season. It's simply
available."
vital. Yes, Catherine, of course.
Available.
My dear.
The
Oh,
word
sister,
seemed to
you must
offend him
surely be as
personally.
excited as
My
I.
carriage
Think of
was
all the
available,
opportunities awaiting
in
us.
the way
I
that an
do, my
unlocked
dear.
house
I
is
am very
available to a
happy for
burglar.
you.
"I have taken nothing, Your Grace. I wished only for passage. I would have left at the first opportunity without troubling you." "You are troubling me now. He said it flatly, as though stating a fact about the weather. He turned to the coachman, who stood a respectful distance away, holding the horses. "Jennings, how far are we from the posting inn at Barnet?" 3 miles, Your Grace. Perhaps 4. The Duke looked at Eleanor again. She could feel his calculation. The practical mechanics of what to do with an unwanted passenger on a rainy night, miles from London, with the nearest inn still distant enough to make walking there in a storm an act of either courage or stupidity. "Get in the carriage," he said. "Your Grace." Not the luggage compartment, the cabin. He opened the door and gestured toward the interior with the lantern. "You are soaked through, you are shivering, and if you develop a fever and die on the road, the paperwork will be intolerable." She stared at him. The remark was so unexpected, so entirely devoid of the righteousness she had braced for, that she almost laughed. She did not, because one did not laugh at a duke, particularly one who had just discovered you hiding in his belongings. But something shifted in her chest, a tiny loosening of the terror that had gripped her since Curzon Street. She climbed into the carriage. The interior was dark and warm, upholstered in deep blue velvet that she could feel but barely see. It smelled of leather and sandalwood and something else, ink perhaps, or old paper. The Duke climbed in after her and sat on the opposite bench, setting the lantern on the small brass hook beside the window. In the enclosed space, he seemed larger than he had outside and closer, and the lamplight gave his features a severity that the rain had softened. "We will stop at Barnet," he said. "You will be given a room at the inn. In the morning, you will make whatever arrangements are necessary for your onward journey, and we shall both forget this peculiar episode. I have no money for a room." "I am aware." The carriage began to move again. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, dripping onto the velvet, and tried to make herself as small as possible. She was acutely conscious of the impropriety of the situation, a young woman alone in a carriage with an unmarried man at night. If anyone were to learn of it, her reputation, already precarious, would be destroyed beyond all possibility of recovery. But then, she reflected bitterly, what reputation remained to destroy? She was a penniless girl who had hidden in a stranger's luggage. She had fallen below the threshold where reputation held any practical meaning. "You speak well," the Duke said, after a silence that had stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. He said it as though the observation irritated him. "My father was an educated man." Was. "He is dead." Another silence. The carriage wheels churned through mud. "And your mother? Also dead.
Yes, Catherine,
When I
of
was
course, my
12.
dear.
She could
Oh,
feel
sister,
him
you must surely
reassessing.
be as
The
excited
clinical
as I.
gaze
Think of all
returned,
the opportunities
this time
awaiting
tempered
us
with
there.
something
I do,
she
my
could not
dear. I am
immediately
very happy for
identify.
you.
Not pity. She would have recognized pity and resented it. Something more restrained than that. An acknowledgement, perhaps, that her circumstances were not entirely of her own making. "You are running from something," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." Or someone. She did not answer. In the lamplight, her hands were trembling, not from the cold, though she was cold, but from the accumulated strain of the evening and the terrible vulnerability of sitting in a stranger's carriage and being seen, truly seen, for the first time in more than a year. "My name is Edmund Ashford," he said, "Duke of Ravenshire. The estate to which we were travelling before your unexpected appearance is called Ashford Hall. It is in Yorkshire, which I mention only so that you understand how far north of London you would have found yourself had you remained undiscovered." "Yorkshire," she repeated faintly. "Indeed, you would have been exceptionally lost." A pause. "I do not customarily introduce myself to stowaways. I expect the courtesy of a name in return." The request was reasonable. It was also impossible to refuse without appearing either ungrateful or suspicious. Eleanor weighed her options in the space of a heartbeat and made a decision that would, in the weeks to come, prove to be both the wisest and the most reckless of her life. "My name is Eleanor," she said.
Stands so stiffly,
Eleanor
almost
Whitcomb.
unnatural.
She gave him her
I find
real
it quite
name.
fascinating.
She gave it because she
I
was
must
tired
confess,
of
my
hiding,
dear,
and because something in
been
his
some
manner,
years since
that
someone
strange
has paid me
combination of
such close
formality
attention.
and dry, almost reluctant decency, made her
suppose I
believe,
never
against all
truly
evidence and
considered
reason,
it until
that he
this
would
moment.
not use it against her.
Indeed.
He studied her face for a long moment. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "we will discuss the rest of your story at Barnet." They did not discuss it at Barnet. When the carriage arrived at the posting inn, a low, timbered building called the Red Lion, whose windows glowed with the promise of warmth, the Duke descended first and spoke briefly with the innkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Hatch, who appeared at the door in a nightcap and regarded the soaked young woman with the practiced suspicion of someone who had seen every variety of human desperation pass through her establishment. Money changed hands. A room was produced. Eleanor was led up a narrow staircase to a small but clean chamber with a fire already laid in the grate and a basin of hot water steaming on the washstand. She expected the Duke to leave. He was a man of rank and responsibility, traveling on what was doubtless important business, and she had already delayed his journey by the better part of an hour. But when she turned back from the doorway to offer her thanks, inadequate as any thanks could be for what he had done, she found him still standing in the corridor, his hand resting on the banister, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Hatch will see that you are fed," he said. "There is a coaching service to London in the morning if you wish to return.
Oh, Charlotte, you
I
cannot
cannot
imagine the
return to
opportunities.
London."
You must attend the assembly this season.
He
It's simply
absorbed this
vital.
without
Catherine,
visible
of course, my
reaction.
dear.
But something
Cecil, you
flickered
must
behind
surely
his
be as
eyes,
excited as I.
a question
Think of
he
all the
chose not to
opportunities
ask.
awaiting us, love. I do, my dear.
"Then
am
I
very
suggest you
happy.
consider your options carefully, Miss Whitcomb. The world is not kind to young women without protection or means." He paused. "I say this not to frighten you, but because you appear to be someone who prefers the truth to its alternatives." "I do, Your Grace." "Then here is a truth. You are, by your own admission, alone, without funds, and in flight from circumstances you have not yet explained. You are currently standing in an inn on the Great North Road at 11 o'clock at night, in the company of a man you met less than 2 hours ago, and your situation in the morning will be no better than it is now, unless something material changes." He reached into his coat and withdrew a card, white, heavy stock, printed with his name and the address of Ashford Hall. He placed it on the small table beside the door. "If you find yourself in need of employment," he said, "my housekeeper, Mrs. Garrick, is in perpetual want of capable staff. I make no promises. I offer only an alternative to whatever you are running from." He inclined his head, the barest formal acknowledgement. "Good night, Miss Whitcomb." He turned and walked down the corridor, and Eleanor stood in the doorway of her room and watched him go, and felt something she had not felt in 14 months. She felt the faint, dangerous stirring of hope. She arrived at Ashford Hall 4 days later, having walked the final 12 miles from the coaching stop at Thirsk because her money had run out in York. The estate announced itself long before the house came into view. First the stone wall that ran along the road for what seemed like miles, then the iron gates with their raven fenials, then the long drive lined with elms, whose bare October branches formed a canopy overhead, like the nave of a cathedral. The house itself stole her breath. It was enormous. Not in the ostentatious manner of the new industrial fortunes, but with the settled, confident grandeur of a building that had stood for centuries and expected to stand for centuries more. Built of pale Yorkshire stone, it rose 3 stories above a formal garden that must have been spectacular in summer, but which now lay dormant, the fountains still, the hedges sculpted into precise geometries that the autumn had softened with rust and gold. Eleanor presented the Duke's card at the servants' entrance and was received by Mrs. Garrick, a tall, angular woman of perhaps 55, with grey hair pinned beneath a cap of immaculate whiteness and a gaze that could have stripped paint from a wall. She examined the card. She examined Eleanor. She asked 3 questions. Could she read? Could she sew? Had she any experience with household accounts? Eleanor answered yes to all 3. Mrs. Garrick assigned her to the position of upstairs maid, a role that placed her in proximity to the family rooms, but not the family itself, which suited Eleanor's purposes precisely. She was given a uniform, a narrow bed in the servants' quarters on the upper floor, and a schedule that began at 5 in the morning and did not end until the fires were banked at 10 in the evening. She had never worked harder in her life.
Oh, Charlotte,
She had
you
never
can't
been
imagine the
happier.
opportunities. We must
The
attend
word
assembly this
surprised
season.
her.
It's simply vital.
Happiness seemed
Yes,
too
Catherine, of
large,
course, my dear.
too presumptuous for what
Oh,
she
sister,
felt,
you must
and
surely
yet
be as
the
excited
clean
as
sheets
I.
on
Think
her
of all the
bed,
opportunities
the
awaiting
meals
us.
in the
I
servants'
do, my
hall,
dear. I am
plain but
very happy
generous,
for you.
the sound of other voices not raised in anger or accusation, but in the ordinary cadence of daily work. The knowledge that when she woke in the morning, no one would seize her arm or inform her that her future had been sold. It was enough. It was more than enough. She saw the Duke rarely in those first weeks. He was a man of business and solitude, spending his mornings in the study with his steward, his afternoons riding the estate or reviewing correspondence, his evenings in the library with a glass of brandy and whatever volume had captured his attention. The household spoke of him with a respect that bordered on reverence, but also with a kind of affectionate bewilderment, as one might speak of a ship that was seaworthy and reliable, but which no one had ever seen in full sail. He had been Duke for 6 years, since the death of his father. He was unmarried. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, lived in Bath and wrote letters weekly urging him to remedy this condition. His younger sister, Lady Charlotte Ashford, was 20 years old, spirited, alarmingly modern in her opinions, and the only person in the household who appeared capable of making the Duke laugh, a sound Eleanor heard once, distantly, through a closed door, and which she thought about for the rest of the day with a frequency that troubled her. She told herself it was gratitude. Nothing more. The man had saved her from the road. He had offered her employment when he owed her nothing. Gratitude was natural, appropriate, and safely contained within the bounds of propriety. Gratitude did not explain why her pulse quickened when she heard his footsteps in the corridor. It happened on a Tuesday, the first real encounter, as opposed to the careful avoidances that had characterized their coexistence since her arrival. Eleanor was in the library, dusting the upper shelves by means of a rolling ladder that required both hands and a degree of faith in carpentry that she did not entirely possess. She had climbed higher than was wise to reach a row of volumes on the topmost shelf and was stretching for a particularly obstinate accumulation of dust when the ladder shifted beneath her. She gasped. Her hand shot out to grip the shelf, dislodging a book that fell with a thud to the floor below. The ladder steadied. Her heartbeat did not. "That is a first edition of Gibbon," said a voice from below. She looked down. The Duke stood in the doorway of the library, his riding coat still on, his boots still muddied from the fields. He was looking at the fallen book with an expression that suggested he was more concerned for its welfare than for hers. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." "Climb down, Miss Whitcomb." Slowly. The last maid who fell from that ladder broke her collarbone, and Mrs. Garrick was inconsolable for the better part of a week, not on account of the maid, I suspect, but on account of the disruption to her schedule. Eleanor descended. She bent to retrieve the fallen gibbon, checking its spine for damage with the automatic care of someone who had grown up in a house full of books. The Duke watched her do this,
Charlotte, you cannot
and she
imagine the
saw,
opportunities.
or
We
thought
must
she
attend the
saw,
assembly this
a
season.
slight
It's simply
change in his
vital.
expression.
Yes, Catherine, of course, my dear.
An interest that went beyond the
sister, you must
casual
surely be as
observation
excited as
of an
I.
employer
Think of all the
watching a
opportunities
servant
awaiting
perform a
us.
task.
I do, my dear.
"You
I
handle
am very
books
happy
as though
for
you are accustomed to them," he said. "My father had a library, smaller than this one certainly, but..." She stopped. She had said too much. Every detail she revealed about her former life was a thread that could be followed back to London, back to Agatha, back to the cage she had escaped. "But," he prompted. "But he valued it greatly," she finished carefully. The Duke took the book from her hands. Their fingers did not touch, but the space between them contracted, a distance measured not in inches, but in awareness. He opened the volume, examined the spine, and placed it on the reading table. "My father valued this library above almost everything," he said, "including at times his children. I spent most of my boyhood in this room, not because I was bookish, but because it was the only reliable place to find him." He looked at her. "What did your father do, Miss Whitcomb?" "He was a clerk at a shipping firm in the city." A clerk. The word from his lips was neither judgment nor dismissal, merely placement, the careful noting of a coordinate on a social map. "He was a good man," Eleanor said, and was horrified to feel her eyes sting. The Duke said nothing. He looked at her for a moment longer, a long, quiet look that contained more than she could interpret, and then he inclined his head and left the library, and she was alone with the dust and the books and the memory of how close their hands had been. After that, the encounters became less accidental. It began with the books. Eleanor would find volumes left on the reading table in the library, not the heavy tomes of history and estate management that the Duke typically favored, but novels. Bronte, Eliot,
Indeed.
a well-worn copy of North and South that someone had marked with a slip of paper at a passage about the distance between classes. She could not be certain they were meant for her. She could not be certain of anything except that each morning, when she entered the library to clean, there was a new book, and each evening when she returned to her room in the servants' quarters, she carried it with her and read by candlelight until her eyes would not stay open. Then it was conversation. Brief, circumscribed by propriety, but increasingly frequent. He would appear in the library when she was working. He would ask her opinion on something he had read, casually, as though the question had only just occurred to him, as though it were perfectly ordinary to seek literary opinions from one's upstairs maid. She answered carefully at first, offering the safe, conventional responses that a servant might reasonably give. But the Duke had no patience for convention. He pressed, he challenged, he argued. And Eleanor, who had spent 14 months in silence, found herself arguing back. "You disagree with Mill on the subjection of women?" she said one afternoon, forgetting herself entirely. "I disagree with Mill on very little, but I find his position on education utopian in a way that ignores the material realities of..." He stopped. They had been sitting across from each other. He in his chair by the fire, she perched on the arm of the sofa with a book in her hands. The formal distance between Duke and maid collapsed entirely by the force of intellectual engagement. He seemed to realize, in the same moment she did, how far they had strayed from the permissible. "Forgive me," he said. "I forget myself." "As do I, Your Grace." A silence fell. It was not empty. It was full of everything they could not say, the knowledge that what was happening between them had no name and no precedent and no possible future within the world they inhabited. He was a duke, she was a maid. The chasm between those two facts was not measured in yards, but in centuries of custom, law, and expectation. And yet, she saw how he looked at her when he thought she was not watching. She saw the way his hand paused, mid-reach for his brandy glass, when she entered a room. She saw the effort it cost him to maintain the formal address. Miss Whitcomb, always Miss Whitcomb, as though her name were a rope he clung to at the edge of a precipice. Lady Charlotte saw it too. The Duke's sister arrived at Ashford Hall in the 3rd week of November, sweeping into the entrance hall with 3 trunks, a lady's maid, a small terrier of uncertain breed, and a quantity of opinions that she began distributing before her traveling cloak was fully removed. She was everything her brother was not. Warm, impulsive, ungoverned by caution, and she took one look at Eleanor and said with the devastating directness of the young and well-born, "You are not a maid." Eleanor, who was carrying a stack of linens down the corridor, stopped. "I beg your pardon, my lady.
I find her
Your
quite
hands.
fascinating.
Maids who have been in
must
service
confess,
for any
my
length
dear,
of time have
it has
roughened
been some
hands.
years since
Yours are
someone has
rough
paid me
now,
such
but
close
recently.
attention.
And you hold yourself like someone who was taught
I suppose I
deportment,
never
not someone who
truly
learned it from
considered it until this
observation."
moment.
Charlotte tilted her head, bird-like. "Also, Edmund has mentioned you 4 times in his letters, which is 4 more times than he has ever mentioned any member of the household staff." Eleanor felt the colour drain from her face and then flood back in a rush that reached the roots of her hair. "Lady Charlotte, I assure you, I am not accusing you of anything. I am observing. There is a difference, though I'm told the distinction is lost on most people." Charlotte smiled, a smile of such frank, uncomplicated warmth that Eleanor felt something inside her crack. "Whatever you are hiding, Miss Whitcomb, I suspect it is more interesting than anything else happening in this house, and I should very much like to know what it is," Eleanor told her. "Not everything, not the full extent of Agatha's cruelty, not the details of Horace Blackwood and his mills, but enough." She told her about her father's death, about the debts, about the marriage that had been arranged without her knowledge or consent. She told her about the carriage in the rain and the Duke's unexpected mercy. Charlotte listened without interrupting, which Eleanor would later learn was the single most remarkable thing Charlotte Ashford was capable of. "You must tell Edmund," Charlotte said when the story was finished. "I cannot." "You must. If this Blackwood person or your stepmother comes looking for
Charlotte,
you,
cannot
and
imagine
they
the
will,
opportunities.
Eleanor,
We
people
must
like
attend
that
the
always
assembly
do,
this season. It's simply
Edmund needs to
vital.
know
Yes,
what he is
Catherine,
protecting.
Of course, my dear.
He is not
Oh,
protecting
sister, you
me.
must
He
surely
gave
be
me
as
a
excited
position.
as I.
That
Think
is
of all
all."
the opportunities awaiting us.
Charlotte
I
looked
do,
at
my
her with
dear.
an
I am very
expression that
happy for
managed to
you.
convey simultaneously deep affection and profound exasperation. "My brother," she said, "has not voluntarily spoken to a woman who was not related to him or employed by him in 6 years. He has refused every introduction our mother has arranged. He has attended precisely 1 ball in the last 3 seasons, and he left before the first waltz. And now he leaves books on the library table for a maid he met in his luggage compartment, and mentions her in his correspondence as though he were unaware he was doing it." She paused. "That is not all, Miss Whitcomb. That is not all, by a very considerable margin." Eleanor did not tell the Duke. She could not bring herself to transform the fragile, unspoken thing between them into something that required acknowledgement, and therefore decision. Decision would mean the end of it, because no decision that a duke could make about a penniless maid would lead anywhere but to the dissolution of whatever they had built in the library, in the stolen conversations, in the silences that said more than words. But Charlotte was right about one thing. They came looking. The letter arrived on the 1st of December, addressed to His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshire, and bearing the return address of a solicitor's firm in London. Mrs. Garrick brought it to the study with the Morning Post, and Eleanor, who was polishing the banister in the entrance hall, saw the Duke's face through the half-open study door as he read it.
I must
He
confess,
went
my
very
dear,
still.
it has been
That
some
evening he
years
summoned
since
her to
someone
the
has paid
study.
me such
She
close
stood before
attention.
his desk as she had stood in the rain outside the
I
Red
suppose I
Lion,
never
aware of the
truly
vast
considered it
distance
until
between
this
them
moment.
and of the fragile bridge that had been built across it, plank by careful plank, over the preceding weeks. "Your stepmother," he said, "has engaged a solicitor to locate you. The solicitor has written to every notable household within 50 miles of London, inquiring after a young woman matching your description." He set the letter on the desk between them. "He has also written to me. Your Grace, the letter states that you are the legal ward of Mrs. Agatha Whitcomb, that you disappeared from her care on the night of October the 14th, and that she is greatly distressed by your absence. It further states that you are engaged to be married to a Mr. Horace Blackwood of Manchester, and that any person found to be harboring you without informing Mrs. Whitcomb of your whereabouts is in violation of... He stopped reading and set the letter down. I need not continue. The legal threats are extensive and I suspect largely fictional. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She clasped them together, pressing them against her skirt to still them. Will you send me back? She asked. The question hung in the air between them. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, the Yorkshire wind drove rain against the windows with the sound of flung gravel. Sit down, the Duke said. She sat. She sat because her legs would no longer support her, and because the chair was there, and because the quiet authority of his voice left no room for refusal. I will not send you back, he said. I will not send you anywhere, but I need you to tell me the truth, the complete truth, Miss Whitcomb, without omission or softening, about what you are running from and why. So she told him. She told him everything. The gambling debts, the locked rooms, the mornings when Agatha would not permit her to eat because the butcher's bill had not been paid, the bruises she had learned to hide beneath long sleeves. The day Horace Blackwood had come to the house and looked at her with an expression that made her skin crawl, and Agatha had smiled, and actually smiled, and told her to be grateful. She told him about the carriage, about the rain, about the 3 shillings and 4pence that were all she had in the world. She told him, and he listened, and when she was finished, he rose from his chair and walked to the window and stood with his back to her for a long time. Mr. Blackwood, he said without turning around, owns textile mills. 3, Your Grace, in Manchester. I know who Horace Blackwood is. He is a man whose labour practices have been the subject of parliamentary inquiry and whose first wife died under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. He is not a man to whom any woman should be given, least of all... He stopped himself. The sentence ended in the air, unfinished, and the silence that followed it was louder than anything either of them had said. You are safe here, he said at last, turning to face her. I will instruct my solicitor to respond to Mrs. Whitcomb's representative. The response will be clear, and it will be final. You are a member of my household, under my protection, and any further attempts to compel your return will be met with the full resources at my disposal. Your Grace, the scandal. Let me concern myself with scandal.
Indeed.
People will talk. If it becomes known that you are sheltering a woman from her legal guardian, that you have involved yourself in... Miss Whitcomb, his voice was very quiet. I have been a duke since I was 24. I have endured gossip, insinuation, and the relentless speculation of London society regarding every aspect of my life, from my political opinions to my marriage prospects. I assure you, I am well practiced in the art of disregarding the opinions of others. She looked at him, he looked at her. The fire burned low between them, and in its fading light his face was stripped of its habitual reserve, and she saw, clearly, unmistakably, what he had been at such pains to conceal. She saw that he was afraid, not of scandal, not of solicitors, not of Horace Blackwood or Agatha Whitcomb, or the accumulated weight of aristocratic expectation. He was afraid of what he felt. He was afraid of the way she had entered his life, soaked, shivering, hidden among his belongings, and rearranged it from the inside, the way a river rearranges the course of a valley. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded once, sharply, as though the words had cost him something, and turned back to the window. You may go, Miss Whitcomb. She went. She climbed the stairs to the servants' quarters and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and pressed her mother's brooch against her palm until the stones left small, sharp indentations in her skin. She did not sleep that night. The weeks that followed were a study in the exquisite torture of proximity. Winter closed over Ashford Hall like a fist, the moors disappearing beneath a blanket of snow that muffled sound and sharpened light and turned the estate into a world unto itself. The household contracted around the fires, servants in the kitchen, the Duke in his library, Lady Charlotte in the morning room with her terrier and her correspondence and her increasingly pointed observations about her brother's state of mind. Eleanor continued her duties. She cleaned the rooms, polished the silver, laid the fires. She continued to read the books left on the library table, Tennyson now and Browning, and once a slim volume of Keats with a passage underlined in pencil. I almost wish we were butterflies and lived but 3 summer days. 3 such days with you I could fill with more delight than 50 common years could ever contain. She did not mention the passage, neither did he. But she knew he had left it for her, and he knew she had found it, and the knowledge sat between them like a held breath. They did not touch, they did not declare. They orbited each other in the measured formal patterns of a dance whose steps had been prescribed by centuries of social order, and if their orbits drew closer with each passing day, if the space between Miss Whitcomb and Eleanor narrowed, if his gaze lingered a fraction longer than propriety allowed, if she found herself arranging the library flowers with a care that had nothing to do with her duties and everything to do with the possibility that he might notice,
I must confess,
neither
my
of them
dear,
acknowledged
it has been
it.
some years
Charlotte
since someone has
acknowledged
paid
it.
me such close
"This is
attention.
absurd," she said to Eleanor one evening when the two of
I
them were
suppose
sitting
I
in the
never
morning room while the
truly
Duke
considered
attended to
it until this
correspondence.
moment.
"You are both miserable, and you are both pretending not to be, and it is making the entire household uncomfortable. Lady Charlotte, do not Lady Charlotte me. I have eyes. Mrs. Garrick has eyes. Even Jennings has eyes, and he is the least observant man in Yorkshire. My brother is in love with you, Eleanor, desperately, hopelessly, and completely, and unless I am very much mistaken, which I am not, you feel the same." Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing to say. The truth of Charlotte's words was so overwhelming, so obvious, so entirely impossible to act upon that any response would have been inadequate. "He will not speak," Charlotte said softly. "He is too honorable and too proud and too aware of the distance between your situations. He believes that to declare himself would be to take advantage of your dependence on his protection. He would rather suffer in silence for the rest of his life than risk making you feel obligated." She reached across and took Eleanor's hand. "But I know my brother, and I know that this silence is destroying him." The crisis, when it came, arrived not in the form of a declaration or a scandal, but in the form of Horace Blackwood himself. He came on a Tuesday in January, a hard, bright winter day when the snow lay thick on the moors and the sky was the colour of hammered steel.
Oh, Charlotte, you cannot
His
imagine
carriage
the
appeared on the
opportunities.
drive
You
at
must attend
2:30 in the
assembly this
afternoon,
evening. It's simply
and
vital.
Eleanor, who
Yes,
was carrying
Catherine,
a
of
tea
course,
tray
my
to the
dear.
morning room, saw
Oh,
it through
sister,
the
you must
window
surely be as
and dropped the
excited as I.
tray.
Think of all the
The crash
opportunities
brought
awaiting
Mrs.
us.
Garrick
I
and
do,
2
my
footmen
dear. I am
running.
very happy for you.
Charlotte appeared from the morning room. The Duke emerged from his study. "He is here," Eleanor said. Her voice did not sound like her own. It was the voice of the girl she had been in Holborn, small, cornered, stripped of everything she had built in the months since her escape. "Blackwood, he is here." The Duke looked at her. Then he looked out the window at the approaching carriage. Then he did something that Eleanor had never seen him do before. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for something to fight and had finally found it. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "you will remain upstairs. Charlotte with her. Mrs. Garrick, please show Mr. Blackwood to the drawing room when he arrives. I will receive him there." "Edmund," Charlotte began. "Now, Charlotte." Charlotte took Eleanor's arm and led her up the stairs. They sat in Charlotte's room, listening to the sounds below. The front door opening, the murmur of voices, then silence. A long, terrible silence. Eleanor pressed her hands together so tightly that her knuckles whitened. "He will ruin everything. Blackwood has money, influence, solicitors. He will argue that I am promised to him, that the contract was legally binding, that my brother is a duke," Charlotte said, with a calm that belied the tension in her jaw. "Dukes outrank factory owners. It is one of the few advantages of the aristocracy that I am prepared to endorse without reservation." They waited.
She stands so
The clock on
stiffly,
Charlotte's
almost
mantelpiece
unnatural.
ticked. Somewhere in the house,
her quite
a door
fascinating.
closed. Then footsteps
I
on the
must confess,
stairs.
my dear,
The Duke's
it has been
footsteps,
some years
Eleanor knew
since
them
someone
now,
has paid
could
me
distinguish
such
them
close
from every
attention.
other tread in the household. He knocked on Charlotte's
I
door,
suppose I
and
never
Charlotte opened it,
truly
and he
considered
stood in the
until this
doorway
moment.
looking not at his sister,
Indeed.
but at Eleanor, and his face held an expression she had never seen on it before. Relief, fierce, barely contained, radiant relief. "Mr. Blackwood has left," he said. "He will not return. He will not contact you. He will not pursue any legal claim. I have made this very clear to him, and I have done so in terms that leave no room for ambiguity." "How?" Eleanor whispered. "I reminded him that I sit on 3 parliamentary committees, one of which is currently investigating labor conditions in northern textile mills. I suggested that his cooperation in this matter would be in his best interest. He agreed." A pause. Eventually, Charlotte made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. She pressed her hand to her mouth and turned away toward the window. Eleanor rose from her chair. She stood before the Duke, this man who had found her in his luggage and taken her in, who had fed her and sheltered her and left her poetry on the library table, who had just faced down the man she feared most in the world and sent him away. And she could not speak. She could not speak because every word she knew was inadequate, because gratitude was too small and love was too large, and the distance between them, Duke and maid, protector
Oh,
and
Charlotte,
protected,
you cannot
the
imagine
richest
the
man in
opportunities. We
Yorkshire,
must
and the
attend the
girl
assembly
with
this
3
week. It will
shillings
be
to her
vital.
name,
Yes,
was a
Catherine,
distance
of
that
course, my
words
dear.
could not cross.
Oh,
But he was
sister, you
looking
must
at her
surely
the
be
way
as
he had
excited
looked
as
at her
I.
in the
Think of all
study
the
that night,
opportunities awaiting us.
unguarded,
I do, my dear.
afraid.
I'm very happy for you.
And she understood then what Charlotte had told her, that his silence was not indifference, but sacrifice, that he had chosen to suffer rather than burden her with a feeling she might feel obligated to return. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was steady. She did not know how. "Edmund." It was the first time she had used his Christian name. The effect was immediate. Something in his face broke open, not dramatically, not with the theatrical collapse of a man in a novel, but quietly, the way ice breaks on a river in spring. A yielding, a surrender of the guard he had kept for so long. "I should not," he began. "You should." Charlotte, with a presence of mind that Eleanor would be grateful for until her dying day, slipped out of the room and closed the door behind her. They stood 3 feet apart. The winter light from the window fell across the floor between them, and the house was very quiet, and the world outside was white and still. "I am not your equal," Eleanor said. "I have no fortune, no family, no name that would not embarrass you in every drawing room in England. I'm aware of what the world would say. I'm aware of what your mother would say. I'm aware that what I feel for you is impossible by every measure that your world uses to define what is possible. And yet," he said, "and yet." She took a breath. "I find that I am tired of impossible things. I have been told for 14 months what I cannot do, what I cannot have, what I must accept. I hid in your carriage because I refused to accept a life that had been chosen for me. I will not now refuse a life I would choose for myself." He closed the distance between them, not quickly, slowly, deliberately,
Indeed.
with the care of a man who understood that what he was doing could not be undone. He stopped when they were close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his throat, and he raised his hand and he touched her face. His fingers were warm against her cheek. The touch was so gentle it was barely there. A question, not a statement. A request, not a demand. Eleanor, he said. Just her name. Just the sound of it, spoken in his voice, in the quiet of the room, with the snow falling outside and the fire burning low and the whole of Victorian England arrayed against them like an army. She lifted her hand and placed it over his. Yes, she said. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, not a kiss of passion, but something deeper than passion. A promise, a covenant, the kind of kiss that says, I will fight for this. I will rearrange the world for this. I will be worthy of this, or I will spend the rest of my life trying. She closed her eyes. His hand cradled her face, and her hand held his. And for a moment, for one perfect, crystalline moment, the world was exactly the size of the space between them, and it was enough. It would not be easy. She knew this. He knew this. There would be scandal, ferocious, unrelenting, the full-throated outrage of a society that treated its hierarchies as natural law.
Of course, my dear.
There would be
Oh,
his
Cecily,
mother's
you must
horror
surely be as
and the
excited as
whispered
I. Think of
cruelties
all
of
the
the tongue
opportunities awaiting
and the
us.
newspapers
I
and
do,
the
my dear.
endless
I am very
exhausting
happy for
labor
you.
of proving that love could be built on something more durable than rank. But there would also be this, the library in winter. The sound of his laugh through a closed door. Books left on the reading table like letters in a language only two people spoke. The moors in spring, when the heather came back and the sky opened wide above Yorkshire like a benediction. There would be this room and this light and his hand on her face, and the knowledge, hard won, tested by fire, unshakable, that she had chosen him and he had chosen her, and the choice was their own. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Ashford Hall, covering the drive where Blackwood's carriage had stood, filling the ruts left by its wheels until the gravel was smooth and white and unmarked, as though he had never come at all.